88.1 The Burg, your music central. My name is Nathan. Welcome to What to Watch Weekends. This morning on What to Watch Weekends, we are going to be talking about, excuse me, we are going to be talking about the 5 Mad Max movies, as Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, came out pretty recently. It definitely premiered its way into theaters very, very recently. As in, it came out yesterday, and I really wanted to talk about it. And so I also covered the first 3 Mad Max movies on What to Watch Wednesdays, the other show that's directly tied to What to Watch Weekends today. And now we're going to talk about those 3 in a little bit more depth. Fury Road, Mad Max Fury Road that is, and Mad Max Furiosa, because I did my due diligence and went to go see it last night. Specifically on the day of release. I'm very excited to talk about it. So we're going to be jumping into Mad Max from 1979, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior from 1981, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome from 1985, Mad Max Fury Road from 2015, and then Furiosa, a Mad Max saga from 2024. So stick around after the break when we jump into Mad Max. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our first movie on this morning's watch list, we're going to be taking a look at the original Mad Max from 1979, available to watch now on the streaming service Max. I could make so many jokes about how you could watch Mad Max on Max and it wouldn't really be all that funny anymore. So I'm just going to kind of leave it to the side. Yes, you can watch a Mad Max on Max. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the plot, this movie follows a police officer by the name of Max, you guessed it, who is a policeman in a distant, not too distant, dystopian Australian future. Basically, a lot of the world's resources have been drained, including gasoline. A lot of it is kind of at its peak of not being able to be used anymore. It's almost run completely dry. And so resources are quite scarce. And in this not post-apocalyptic quite yet, more so just dystopian, Max is, as a police officer, sent to go after a biking gang who is terrorizing the road and kind of gets a more personal vendetta against them after they murder his wife and son. And so it's kind of about him sort of having to wrestle with the dystopian landscape around him while also having to avenge his family. One of the biggest sort of aspects of the original Mad Max, one of the most notable things about it, is it kind of kicked off the Australian New Wave back in the 1970s and 80s specifically. For those of you who don't know what the Australian New Wave is, it's essentially the time in film history when people were like, hey, Australia can actually make some good movies, and Mad Max is one of those. People were like, oh, I didn't know they really put a lot of effort into making movies. They never really seemed to be a prominent player in the theater. And with something like Mad Max, they were like, oh, wait, never mind. I think they can make some good movies. Here's the proof. It's a bit difficult to fully catalog because, at least on my end, because I haven't seen a lot from that time period. I've just seen the Mad Max movies, but I can say with confidence that Crocodile Dundee usually falls into that category of the Australian New Wave. For those of you who aren't familiar with Crocodile Dundee, it's basically about an Australian man coming to America and him being different. I haven't even seen the movie. I just know that there's the quote, "That's not a knife, that's a knife," and everybody knows that quote. So that came from the Australian New Wave is the big point I'm trying to make. And I think that's interesting. After watching the original Mad Max, I was like, this has a different style to it. It doesn't feel like an American action movie from the 70s or the 80s. It feels a lot more, I guess, we're grounded in the absurd, almost. That's the best way to kind of describe the overall feel of the movie. It doesn't necessarily feel like a traditional sort of action cop movie. It's very much intentionally set in like massive deserts and almost a complete wasteland, but with some parts here and there that aren't completely destroyed quite yet, because again, it's just dystopian. So it's like, it's this weird middle ground of, well, they're meant to go for that look in the first place, but they're also filming in Australia, which is kind of notorious for having a lot of deserts and being blisteringly hot and just kind of being barren in the first place. So it's kind of honestly the perfect place to film it if you're gonna film if you're gonna film a dystopian or like near post-apocalyptic movie. Filming it in Australia is not a bad choice. Um, I should mention that for all my praises, when I first watched the original Mad Max, I stopped about 40 minutes in and then I went to bed. I was getting a little bored and I was also staying up late to watch it. And part of the reason for that was just because sometimes I don't necessarily plan out my day correctly and end up watching a movie at like 10:30 at night, and then I get tired over the course of it and I want to go to bed, and I get so tired that I start almost hallucinating in a way what's going on in the movie. I kind of tune in and out, and unless it's like a horror movie where it's really keeping my attention, and even then that's not a guarantee. The point is that sometimes I end up watching movies when I'm kind of tired. And that's not a good idea because it doesn't necessarily keep the mind sharp and I can't necessarily remember a lot from it. So I usually tend to stop watching them so that I can get some rest and come back to it at a later time. With the original Mad Max, that was only part of the reason that I stopped watching it. Sometimes I just stop watching movies because I'm a little bored by them. And the original Mad Max, rather unfortunately, did fall into that category aside from the whole me being tired and needing to stop to take a break. I legitimately was a little bored. Part of the problem with the original Mad Max, and something that I was talking about with a friend a couple of days ago, is that it's not necessarily it doesn't really tell you its story or its world or its characters. It really just throws you in and then explains it a lot later down the line. The whole plot about Max kind of going out to take revenge against the biker gang and specifically the leader Toe Cutter, which, yes, that's a goofy name, but stick with me. That whole plot doesn't really start until about 40 minutes in. And I was basically like tuning out and stopping right before it got interesting. So that's not good. And keep in mind that this movie is an hour and 20 minutes long. About halfway through it, I felt like nothing was happening to the point where I didn't feel bad about necessarily stopping to go to bed. And it almost sends the message that like going to bed was more interesting than watching this. That feels like a massive shoot down of the movie. Like I've spent some time praising it a little bit, and now it sounds like it's actually not all that good. I will say after the 40-minute mark, where once his family is killed off, rather unfortunately and kind of brutally, it does get more interesting. You kind of get the sort of progression of Max into the character that would later sort of crop up in the next two movies. And so knowing that, it's a bit of a slog, but I do think it's kind of essential to the world building and to the overall understanding of what you're going to get yourself into. It sets the tone more than anything else, and so those first 40 minutes are not necessarily easy to skip out on. It. They shouldn't have been cut, and I think they do serve some purpose. It's just that in terms of story progression and character progression, they are very much a nothing is happening 40 minutes. So just keep that in mind when watching it. And that's part of the reason why I don't necessarily rank it up super high, but I do think it's at least worth watching in comparison to the fact that like it's basically gone on to be so influential over the last couple decades, what with multiple movies coming out after it, that it definitely did something right. It's not like it completely failed, but it's not like the perfect version of the formula that they would later develop. So just keep that in mind. And well, like I said, because it's not a perfection of the formula, keep in mind that it is dystopian. It's not fully post-apocalyptic. You don't necessarily see a lot of the influence on the other movies directly in terms of their style and their cinematography or like the overall setting and the world that it inhabits. It's a lot more kind of condensed and contained, but it also kind of has the benefit of being the first one and you going, okay, maybe they just didn't know where they were going to go with the story yet. Maybe it was just going to be one movie in the making. And I've read some articles that sort of suggest that it was just going to be one and then they kind of came up with sequels as they went along. So just keeping that in mind is going to help you get through the movie even more. I'd still recommend watching it, what with it influencing things like Mad Max Fury Road with the Road Warrior and with Furiosa coming out. And speaking of the Road Warrior in that list, after the break, we are going to jump into Mad Max the Road Warrior, so stick around for that. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. My name is Nathan. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our second movie on the watch list tonight, this morning, running What to Watch Wednesdays, I tend to say we're going to take this look at this movie on the watch list tonight, and then I get into the habit of that, and then when I'm on What to Watch Weekends, I start saying tonight when it's 9:30 in the morning. So apologies for that. But for our second movie on the watch list this morning, wow, I'm all over the place, we are going to be taking a look at Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior from 1981, also available to watch on the streaming service Max. So, after the first Mad Max movie, where his family is killed by a biker gang, and it's kind of set in a dystopian Australian setting, the world basically goes to crap, and it turns into an actual post-apocalypse. In this post-apocalyptic wasteland, Max sort of just wanders around on his own and eventually comes across a group of survivors who are somewhat peaceful, and he's drafted by them to help them defend themselves from a ruthless band of marauders led by a character known as Lord Humongous, which is an incredibly funny name for a lot of reasons, but at any rate, Max is drafted by them and decides to help them out just because he's got nothing better to do since it's the wasteland and he could just be wandering around or doing something. And he decides to do something for once. So that's cool of him. I'll be honest with you. I do really like Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. It's just that I can't exactly remember all the reasons why I like it. Because from my perspective, what I ended up doing when watching the Mad Max movies is I kind of made the inherent mistake of watching Mad Max Fury Road first. I watched it before I saw any of the other ones. I wanted to just kind of jump into that one because I'd heard it'd been good and it looked interesting. I'd watched it and I absolutely loved it. And then I went back and watched the other three, just to kind of say I've seen them all. And the biggest reason that's a problem when it comes to the Road Warrior is that I just remember that the Road Warrior had a lot of influence on Fury Road. I could see a lot of the direct influences between the two movies, and that's intentional because they're all directed by George Miller, and I think, and it's well within the realm of possibility to say that when one of them has sort of certain elements in it, that being the Road Warrior, when it had specific things in it, with Fury Road being kind of a sequel and or reboot and or just kind of continuation of the story, it had basically been like almost 2 decades since the last one, and they basically threw in a lot of callbacks to the other movies just because it was kind of a amalgamation of the Mad Max series as a whole. And so essentially, what I ended up getting out of the Road Warrior was this is where a lot of the callbacks came from. And then I kind of tuned out the rest of the movie. Tuned out is in heavy quotes because I was still watching, I was still paying attention, I still really liked the movie, but I was also kind of just caught up and going, oh, it's from Fury Road, I remember that. I remember that from Fury Road, I remember that from Fury Road. And that's not necessarily a perfect thing to have happen when you're watching a movie and you want to judge it based off of its own merits. But I can at least say that I do remember that this movie had a certain style to it. I definitely remember what Lord Humongous looks like. I remember him looking quite menacing and very weird. A lot of it, when reading the article on it, I realized that it was known for its punk aesthetic, and thinking back, I completely remember that. It's very much set in, again, a post-apocalypse, but it's not necessarily like a normal post-apocalypse that you'd think of where it's like everyone is being chased down by zombies and they all look like disheveled survivors. It's a bunch of punk rock bands in the middle of the Australian outback, because Australia doesn't really like to do things like we do here in America. And I got to respect them for that because that's definitely an interesting take, to say the very least. It did come out in 1981, so it does kind of make sense, but it's just kind of a goofy thing. I do remember that being a very heavy sort of permeating factor in the movie. I do remember as well that that aesthetic in turn again influenced Fury Road later down the line, and so I didn't I didn't necessarily soak it in as much as I could, but I do remember it being there, and that's kind of half the battle there. Um, I can definitely say that the one thing that fully sticks out in my mind is that there's a character within the movie who kind of pilots this gyrocopter. He's essentially flying a very small helicopter made up of a bunch of scrap metal and ceiling fans and stuff like that. Or not even like ceiling fans, it's more like big industrial fans. And I remember that character basically just showing up at probably the least convenient moments just to yell at Max, and then them having this really like annoying combative relationship where Max wants to do something and he's like, the gyrocopter can help me, and then the gyrocopter guy just doesn't help him at all. I remember it being a funny situation because didn't I didn't like the gyrocopter character at all. Like, he was annoying, but I loved hating on him. I just was like, "You're such an idiot. This is so stupid. Why do humans fight in the middle of a post-apocalypse? Shouldn't they be teaming up?" And the answer is no. They should not. They should be constantly in conflict because that creates a good way to drive your story when you're making a movie about the post-apocalypse. And so I can't exactly fault it for that. I remember having that character of like one that you really love to honestly hate. And I do appreciate it for that. Aside from all of those things, I think The Road Warrior is by far the best of the original trilogy. If I could remember every exact reason why, we'd be here for a while and I'd mostly not remember it. But I can definitely say that with confidence just because I remember the first one and I remember its flaws in terms of not necessarily starting until a little later, not being as fast paced. And I remember the third movie not being very good either. I remember that one specifically being bad. And so if I don't have any horrible memories of The Road Warrior, it's usually safe to assume that it was good enough. It definitely held my attention. I didn't feel sort of scammed out of my time or patience while watching it. And if I did, I would have definitely remembered it a lot more for those reasons. But since I don't have that in my memory, I think it's just a safe assumption to say that I definitely enjoyed it. And so I'm just going to go with that. But a movie that I do remember being scammed out of my time on, one that I felt was just bad, is going to be the one that we talk about next. That being Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome. I have a lot of things to say about this one because I do remember certain aspects of it. I remember it being not good. So stick around after the break when we jump into that. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our third movie on the watch list this morning, we are going to be taking a look at Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome from 1985, available to watch on Max, the streaming service. Mad Max and Max. Anyways, so yes, it's called Beyond Thunderdome, not Beyond the Thunderdome, which kind of annoys me, but there's a lot of other things that annoy me about this movie. And to get into that, we have to kind of examine the plot first. Yes, it's legitimately so annoying to me that even the plot drives me a bit crazy. And let's get into that. After the last movie, The Road Warrior, where he helps a group of somewhat peaceful survivors and helps them drive off a horrible marauder, someone who's going to basically steal all their stuff. He's basically done something good. Max ends up wandering into the wasteland yet again, and he ends up in the city Bartertown, or the town Bartertown, but at any rate, society has kind of fallen, so it's kind of difficult to classify it, and I'm just going to move on from that. In Bartertown, a town led by a bunch of crooks who like to steal stuff because it's bartering, he ends up meeting the leader of Bartertown, a character known as Auntie Entity, who is played by Tina Turner. which is really funny. And they essentially force him to fight in the Thunderdome, a gladiator-like arena that's a big dome, sort of like it's essentially a cage in the shape of a dome, and it's a gladiator arena. About 35 minutes in, he basically gets away from the Thunderdome and ends up being taken into the middle of the woods by a bunch of feral kids who live on their own and have their own society of young kids who are now just wild animals doing absolutely nothing. They all believe him to be God, and they ask him to help them rebuild a plane so that they can leave and start anew in a new society. That right there is my essential problem with Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome, is that the plot feels like two completely different stories meshed into one. The first half is pretty good for a Mad Max formula. It's definitely not focused on Max, it's just set in the wasteland where he's thrown into a situation with a bunch of characters, their leader, and the way that they sort of operate, and he has to sort of figure out what to do while in that situation. The second half is a very weird situation where he's doing the same thing, but it's with a bunch of young kids, and they also seem to care about him a lot more than most people would whenever he's in one of these situations. He's treated as like a god. They think he's their savior of some kind, and it's just real weird. It's real weird the entire time. And because it's a bunch of kids, they can't act, and it becomes kind of grating after 10 minutes or so, if I'm being gracious here. It legitimately, aside from the fact that it's just weird that there's a bunch of kids on their own, it's just like not fun to watch at all. I will fully admit that this movie is honestly weird, bad, and in comparison to the two that came before it even, it is abysmal. It is legitimately a awful movie if you compare it to the other two. On its own, it could pass as a somewhat competent movie. And again, it's weird because the first half definitely is good. The first half with just the Thunderdome works, but when the feral children get involved, it tanks the movie really hard. It wouldn't be worth harping on about if it didn't take up a significant, like the full second half of the movie is dedicated to that storyline. And if it was just a small thing that happened, I wouldn't care. But because it's the entire second half, it legitimately drags the rest of the movie down with it. It doesn't matter that the Bartertown part is good, and the Thunderdome is definitely an interesting idea. It's just like, it's a gladiatorial arena, and it gives it some fun action scenes. If you have that second half in there, it's going to feel bad, and it feels bad. I don't like it. It legitimately drags it down. I should also mention that one thing I totally forgot until doing some research is that at some points in this movie, Mad Max has long hair. It's like half dreadlocks, half mullet, and it doesn't look good at all. I get that it's like in post-apocalypse, and so people tend to grow their hair out and they can't really shave it, and I get all of that. But it doesn't look good on Mel Gibson, so I'm going to knock points off for that alone. It seems a bit trivial, but it came as a shock that I was like, I thought these were the only problems with the movie, but I completely forgot about the hair. That's awful. And I again could give it some props, which is that the first half is the traditional Mad Max formula. It's focused around him being in the Thunderdome, him being in Bartertown, and kind of working through that. But then the second half is just not there. The first half has survival, it has him figuring out the town, but I could say it in so many different ways. But you've got to understand that the feral children are just weird. They shouldn't be there, and there are so many questions about why they decided to do it that way. The last thing I could really say about Beyond Thunderdome, well, two last final things, is that one, Rick and Morty did parody the Mad Max universe in one of their episodes. I believe it was like a premiere to one of like either the season 3 or season 4 or something like that. I don't exactly remember. It's been a while since I've seen Rick and Morty, but what I can confirm is that they parody Mad Max, the Mad Max universe. They go into an alternate dimension, and it's essentially the entire world of Mad Max, and then Summer ends up falling in love with a warlord or something like that. I can say with confidence that they definitely were parodying the Thunderdome, because they have a Thunderdome. They have a big dome cage where they do gladiatorial fights and stuff like that. And I can also say with confidence that they parodied the worst Mad Max movie by doing that. That's a very funny feat for Rick and Morty, of all things. Like, you parodied Mad Max. Congratulations, you parodied the worst one. Great. Round of applause. Woo! I can also say that Thunderdome is a weird outlier in the series, aside from its plot elements, for one minor reason. The other two came out in 1979 and 1981, and they're both technically rated R. Like, back then the rating system wasn't as nuanced as it is now. It took until the 80s until the PG-13 rating was invented, but they were definitely kind of violent and out there. Beyond Thunderdome is weird because it's one of the few it's the only one in the entire series to be rated PG-13. Like I said, it took until the 80s. This came out in 1985, so it does kind of match up, but it's like, why was this one given a PG-13 rating? What specifically were they thinking when they did that? It stands out more than it should, just because it's the only one that does it, and I could pretend like that's the reason why it's bad, but there are a lot of other issues to really drag it down, so I don't think that was the actual reason. It's just funny to sort of point out and go, I wonder why that is. But I could wonder and wonder, and yet I would not know anything. But what I can tell you is I know a lot more about Mad Max Fury Road than I do about Beyond Thunderdome. And I know a lot about what I like about that movie. And so after the break, we will jump in to Mad Max Fury Road, a movie that I've been very excited to talk about here on the show. So stick around for that. And Joel, welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our third, or more so fourth movie on the watch list this morning, we are going to be taking a look at Mad Max Fury Road from 2015, available to watch on Max, the streaming service. So for those of you who are not familiar with the plot of Fury Road at all, this movie follows Max, again from the other three movies, this time played by Tom Hardy instead of Mel Gibson for specific reasons that I don't want to touch on. Max is a lone warrior who is captured by the War Boys, essentially these henchmen of the evil Immortan Joe. Immortan Joe being this crazy figure who is... I could explain so much about him. But essentially, Immortan Joe is the leader of the Citadel, one of the last refuges in the Wasteland. And after he's captured by Immortan Joe, Max ends up being put into the crazy chase situation where one of Immortan Joe's lieutenants, known as Empress Furiosa, ends up running away from the Citadel and ends up trying to escape him and his lackeys. And the main reason Immortan Joe cares about this is because A, she's carrying a tanker truck or a war rig full of a bunch of gas, and she also ends up smuggling out his slave wives, who he uses to produce an heir to conquer the wasteland. I'm not going to touch on that subject too much because it's a very uncomfortable one, but essentially she rescues his wives. And he doesn't like that, so he sends a bunch of his lackeys after them, and right in the middle of all of it is Max, who's just kind of trying to get out of the situation. But after running into Furiosa, he ends up deciding to help them, and so it's a very long sort of chase scene as they try to get to Furiosa's birthplace, known as the Green Place, and escape Immortan Joe for good. So that's a very long-winded way of explaining the plot of Fury Road. Let me tell you right now that you could look at it on paper and be like, that sounds like a lot. It's really not, because the way the movie is paced and edited and sort of structured out, you're going to get it pretty quickly. I love it for that reason, but I also love it for so many other reasons. I love it for the colors that they use, the bright, bold, massive sort of color palette that they ended up going with instead of going with this desaturated look like a lot of post-apocalyptic movies. They really cranked up the saturation. Now everything is just bright and out there and in your face. Everything flashes. Everything's just so incredibly deep and colorful and rich in a weird way. I love the cinematography, the way it flows, the way it's functioning. I love the editing in between that cinematography to make it feel kinetic and just constantly moving at 5,500 miles an hour. And I love the music, the way that sort of influences the way the action feels. The music just constantly revving up and getting you going for the movie to keep on surprising you the entire time. I love the way that the characters are portrayed. Immortan Joe specifically, you know he's evil from the moment he shows up, and you just run with it. I love the way the action feels. All of the fight scenes don't feel repetitive. They feel interesting and full of life and color to watch them again. Color everywhere. I love the acting. I love Tom Hardy's performance. I love Charlize Theron as Furiosa. All the wives are great. Every single other character, specifically Immortan Joe as well, and some of the war boys. Everything about this movie is so good. I'm going on for a while about it. Let me tell you, there's a reason for it, and that is Mad Max Fury Road is one of my favorite movies of all time. I cannot get enough of this movie. I've seen it about 3 times. I watched it 2 days ago for my birthday specifically, and I was just like, I keep forgetting how much I love this movie. Why do I keep forgetting that? It's such a good movie. So the main reason I rewatched it a couple of days is not just for the sake of being able to rant about it on the show, because Furiosa, the prequel to it, came out yesterday, and I was like, I want to make sure I have it prepared. I have that prepared in my mind. I want to remember what I'm going to get into again. And I got to be honest, when rewatching it, I was again confirmed that it was one of my favorite movies just because of how it still surprised me even after I'd seen it twice before. There's so many moments that I completely forgot about that I went, oh, that happens, right. One of the biggest things I got on a rewatch of Fury Road is that it's a lot more bizarre than I originally thought it was. I thought it was kind of a more straightforward post-apocalyptic movie, and it is. And the plot is definitely simple. Like I said, it sounds like a lot to explain, but the big thing to keep in mind is it's about Furiosa going to the green place, going back home, and Max is just kind of along for the ride, and the Immortan Joe is chasing after her because she stole his wives, right? That's all you really need to know to kind of get into the plot of the movie. A lot of it is kind of background details, sort of lore and world building elements to kind of help tie the story into a greater context. The story itself is quite straightforward, and I do like that aspect of it. And for that reason, I automatically assumed that it was going to be kind of a straightforward. A lot of the moment-to-moment stuff was going to be a lot more straightforward. It wasn't going to be incredibly crazy. And I heard one of my film instructors say that it was like a crazy masterpiece. He was like, this movie is almost like fully demented. It's like straight up bonkers. And I was like, I don't remember it being that bonkers. Maybe I just have a weird tolerance for that kind of thing. When I rewatched it, I went, oh, right. Now I remember. Oh, right. That scene. Oh. Here's that shot. Whoa, whoa, whoa. This is crazy. This is bonkers. This is out there. This is wild. This is kooky. This is kooky as all get out. It feels practically fully unhinged at moments. It's like, why aren't characters unhinging their jaws and screaming? And they still do that. Immortan Joe wears this face mask that has like teeth on it. It's like a weird sort of animalistic jaw to it, and it's also like a breathing apparatus because it's got 2 tubes going to it. And I was like, there's no way that opens, right? It's just a thing made out of teeth. But then he starts screaming at one point, and it fully opens up. I'm just like, that looks weird. That's crazy. What on earth is going on? That is the full extent of Fury Road. It is straightforward, but it is also bonkers. You shouldn't go into this expecting to see something normal out of any movie you've seen before. It's not a normal movie. And I loved it for that when I rewatched it. I was like, I didn't realize how bizarre this was. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I think for that reason, the biggest complaint I have about Fury Road is that there's truly no other movies like it. There have been movies that have similar styles or movies that maybe try to do this kind of thing, but Fury Road feels like a very lightning in a bottle movie. A lot of it is dependent on the style, the look, the feel of the music, and the action and the editing specifically. The editing is so good. But for that reason, it also just doesn't feel like it can be easily replicated without a lot of time put into doing that. One of the biggest things about it is that this movie looks incredibly janky. That's the best way of describing it. They basically lower the frame rate. They lower everything and make it look almost stop motion like so that you can see every single frame of the movie in clear detail. With a lot of action movies, there's usually motion blur, which motion blur is when something moves and it's kind of blurry. I know that sounds very self-explanatory, but it's easy to sort of just let that fade into the wayside and not really be paid attention to when you're watching a movie. But when it's not there, it becomes really noticeable very quickly. I had to look it up while watching it for the first time. I was like, why does it look like this? That's crazy. What on earth? It looks so incredibly janky. I thought it was like a legitimate problem with my monitor at first when watching it. I was like, why does it look like that? And it turns out it's entirely intentional. They specifically made it look that way. They engineered it to do that. And on the one hand, it's such a good style. It's such a good idea. I love the way it looks. But at the same time, it's partially disorienting and causes a lot of issues in between the action scenes where you can see all the frames, but if you're struggling to kind of maintain the continuity or you're kind of showing it from different angles, sometimes the audience can get confused. Sometimes they can get overwhelmed by seeing that kind of style be put into theaters. I can almost imagine it being, not even almost, I can fully imagine it being like a photosensitivity thing, legitimately. And on the one hand, I'm all for going, kind of pushing past that barrier into the photosensitive realm. But I also think it's a little too overwhelming, and I don't think every movie should do it. It feels like something that is unique to Fury Road that a lot of movies just can't replicate lest they're taking a massive risk. And Fury Road was taking a lot of risks when it was made. So legitimately, I'm just trying to say that it feels like a lightning in a bottle movie. Something that you can't necessarily replicate, something that you can't necessarily do all over again, because otherwise it may not work. People might say you're ripping it off, and it was already taking so many risks that it was like there's no way that they could possibly do it all over again and get it exactly right just the way they did it the first time. It's just so difficult to do. And it stands alone for that reason as this bizarre masterpiece that you can never really live up to. I want to make movies like Fury Road. I want to just fully go all the way with this weird style, this bizarre idea, this crazy notion of what you're trying to say with a movie. And I don't think I can go in the Fury Road direction because a movie like this comes along once in a lifetime. You never want to miss seeing something like that for the first time. And I could go so much into so much further detail with Fury Road, but keep in mind that I've already gone into plenty of detail as is. I love it for so many reasons, and the biggest one is that it never ever lets up. It's a movie so incredibly well paced that when it fades to black is the only moment you feel like you're not engrossed in the story. You're not engrossed in the characters. You're not engrossed in the action. When it fades to black for that 1 millisecond, you're like, okay, I've gotten a break. Then it fades back and you go, dang it, I was trying to get a break. I'm not getting a break. it just, that to me is one of the greatest accomplishments for this movie, among many others. But again, I could go on, and we'd be here all day. So there is sort of an obligation here to move on to the last movie after the break, which will be Furiosa: A Mad Max Saga. Keep in mind that Furiosa is a prequel to Mad Max Fury Road, so it's interesting to talk about it in the context of that. And I'm very excited to talk about it since I watched it last night, and I have some thoughts about it. So I hope you all stick around for that. 88.1 The Burg, your music central. Welcome back to What to Watch Weekends. For our fifth and final movie on the watch list this morning, we are going to be taking a look at Furiosa: A Mad Max Saga from 2024, available to watch now in theaters. So this movie came out yesterday, and I've been excited for it for quite a while. And so I figured might as well talk about the other Mad Max movies if I'm going to go see Furiosa on opening day. So I definitely did that. And now we get to the moment that I've been waiting for, which has been to talk about Furiosa, something that I've sort of been sitting with since last night, which is easy to do when I watched it last night. At any rate, Furiosa is a movie that came out. That sounds like I'm saying something bad. I'm going to just back up and go into the plot first before I go into any reviews. Let's just recap here. So if you remember, in Fury Road, there was the character Empress Furiosa, played by Charlize Theron. She's a character who had a bit of a mystery to her in Mad Max Fury Road. She was definitely the main supporting character alongside Max, or mostly the main character, because Max wasn't really a character in that movie. He had not as much growth as someone like Furiosa, I'd say. But at any rate, it is essentially her backstory, how she was captured, how she came to be working with Immortan Joe, why she ended up kidnapping, or ended up allowing the wives to escape, and what kind of drives her as a character when she tries to go back home to the Green Place. What was the Green Place to her? What was her experience? What happened with her? And that's exactly what Furiosa, the movie, sort of hopes to answer for you. And it sort of shows that through the capture and transformation of her over many years, rather than being kind of condensed into a 2-day time span. I remember looking it up, it's specifically from ages 10 to 26. And that's a long period of time to cover. And so to kind of cut to the chase, is Furiosa as good as Mad Max Fury Road? Unfortunately, no. I can say that with full confidence that it's not as good as Fury Road, in my opinion. I think that Fury Road is this bizarre, kooky masterpiece, and Furiosa feels a little more safer, on the safer side, in a way that doesn't exactly fit the mold of Fury Road. But that doesn't necessarily mean I would recommend not watching Furiosa. I do still think I would still recommend watching it. It's still worth looking at and watching. If you have the option to go see it, I would still recommend it. It's still good in its own way. But there are some minor issues with it, as with any movie, possibly. It's no perfect film, and there is definitely some things here and there that don't work for it. And one thing I do have to preface is that I've already compared it to Fury Road. One of the things that I noticed while watching it is I said to myself, I probably should have kind of tapered my expectations a little bit, because I was expecting something a lot more in line with Fury Road. Something bizarre, something weird, something janky, something incredibly saturated with color and vibrance and weird and out there. And I didn't end up getting that in the end. I got something a little more straightforward, something a little more safe in the line of post-apocalyptic movies. It looked a lot more like the post-apocalyptic movies, and anytime it looked a bit janky was during some of the more action-heavy sequences, and even then it wasn't on the same level as Fury Road. It definitely had a different style. It was going for something a little different, and I should have sort of done my research and figured out that it wasn't going to be as crazy as Fury Road. Although, to be fair, some of it did look like it was going to be along those lines. And to be honest with you, I think I can be excused a little bit for thinking it's going to be like Fury Road, because Furiosa is from Fury Road. It makes sense to me that when they make a prequel to Fury Road, they take inspiration from Fury Road. It seems a bit obvious when I say it out loud like that. But at the same time, I also think that they do earn the right to try and do something else with it. They earn since they're the filmmakers and since they're the ones coming up with it. I'm talking specifically about George Miller here, the one who's usually responsible for directing these movies. I think it is at least palatable, and I can at least excuse it a little bit for trying something different. I don't think it gets a full pass, but I think that when they tried it, they didn't exactly fail at what they were trying to do. And so I can at least excuse it on the virtue of it's not a bad movie for not following the Fury Road formula. And it's just a little annoying to me as a super big Fury Road fanboy that they didn't exactly take inspiration from Fury Road. But it has some other issues that kind of could get in the way of it. One of the biggest ones, and one of the things that I was worried about when I sort of saw it being announced and I saw the trailer for it, and one thing that one of my friends was pointing out, is that there has been a bit of a trend in movies sometimes. The best way to sort of refer to it is the Marvel Cinematic Universe's tendency to focus on the girl power aspect. I haven't really seen a whole lot of Marvel movies in general, but I am familiar with this. I've heard it referenced before, and I've seen it in some of the things that I've watched, and it's not necessarily something that I like. It's focused on a character who is a woman who is automatically good at everything, and then is more like, girl power, look at this, we're awesome, and we don't need help. It's just like, if you want to write a good female character, you have to make them struggle for what they want and sort of grow over time. They can't automatically be perfect at everything. That kind of defeats the point of the story itself. And it's also about like not being a jerk as a character. You have to sort of make the audience relate to you. You have to make the audience care about you as a character. And I think that's the main issue with that sort of syndrome, that idea of the Marvel girl idea. And unfortunately, Furiosa could have possibly fallen into that trap along the way, and it feels a bit like it did at certain points. But there are some factors to negate that on the off chance. First of all, Furiosa has a very difficult childhood. Let's just say that within the first 30 minutes you go, oh, that's brutal. Oh, that's even more brutal. Oh, that's I think she's dealing with some stuff. I think how old is she? 10? Oh no. That's really sad. Okay. You kind of get into that mindset of going, oh, great, that's not good. And for that reason, it gets a bit of an excuse to sort of have her, I guess, rise above it and in turn be a bit perfect at everything she does. And I think if she didn't have as tragic of a backstory, I would have not forgiven it. That's the other reason that those types of stories with the whole Marvel girl power thing tend to not work, is because the character doesn't really do anything to earn it. They just kind of are that way for no reason. Whereas Furiosa feels like she definitely earned the right to try being perfect at everything. And keep in mind that I was also thinking while after the movie, I was like, okay, this movie takes place basically from when she's a young girl to pretty much the night before Fury Road happens. That's not exactly a spoiler. It's well known that it's a backstory. So, and it's a prequel to Fury Road, so it's not necessarily a spoiler to say that that's what happens. So it takes place over the course of quite a few years, and they're just showing small snapshots in between those moments to really between those that long span of time, they're showing individual snapshots, almost days or only a couple, like one day out of those past couple of over that span of years. And for that reason, I give it a little bit of an excuse again for not exactly showing all of her struggles and all of her training to get to where she is. When she gets older, it makes sense that she's a little bit better at the things she's doing, and it makes sense that she's somewhat perfect at a lot of the stuff she's trying to do. And she still goes through some pain and suffering along the way, so it doesn't necessarily let up in terms of something that would be considered a Marvel story where it's just like, oh, here's some difficulties here there. No, it still remains twisted enough for me to go, okay, that's upsetting and horrifying, and I understand why you probably fight to be better at sort of getting revenge for that exact thing. And I can excuse you being kind of perfect, Little Miss Perfect some of the time for that reason. And I'll give it a little slack. I can give it slack. I can definitely say that the two things I really liked about Furiosa was the music by Tom Holkenberg, otherwise known as Junkie XL. That's his sort of nickname in the industry. The music that he used was basically the same that he used in Fury Road, just a bit slower, and I was very surprised at how much that sort of changed the feel and the style of the movie itself. It definitely feels cohesive in its style. It's not trying to go off the Fury Road one, but it's definitely not going with the generic post-apocalyptic one in certain aspects of it. It feels like it's trying to be its own thing, and I think it succeeds most of the time. I will also say that I personally liked Anya Taylor-Joy as Furiosa. I may be a bit biased there, but I do think she fills the role that Charlize Theron played fully in a good enough way. And it's also great that Chris Hemsworth is the villain. I know I went off on the Marvel storyline a lot, but I think Chris Hemsworth as the villain is just so funny. And I don't even have like an attachment to Thor as a character in the movies. I liked seeing him there, and I liked how he went about his plan. It just worked. I also will say that Immortan Joe is in the movie. It kind of made sense because he was such a integral part of Furiosa's life in Fury Road. And I will say it's very weird because he's still definitely a bad guy, but he's not the primary antagonist of the movie like he is in Fury Road. He's kind of a background character who's almost a supporting character to Furiosa's story. Almost, in a very strange way. And I just think that was a bit of a whiplash thing. Again, I went into this thinking it was going to be a lot like Fury Road, and I was a little disappointed that it wasn't. But I do think that the style that it used and the way it went about things merits its existence enough. I think they earned the right to try and branch off a little bit. And even though it's a prequel and people are kind of sick of prequels and knowing every single thing about a movie, I think it works. I don't think it's bad. I would still recommend watching it. And I also have the personal selfish reason that if Furiosa does do good in the box office, they will be making a sequel to Mad Max Fury Road, which more than likely will follow the Fury Road formula a little closer. And I want to see that so incredibly badly. So high recommendation for me to go see Furiosa in theaters. I think I want to give a closing thought here. And I want to, it's not going to be a perfect one, but I want to give it because I think it's important to note. In terms of series out there, the Mad Max series has been around for quite a while, but not as long as other ones. I will say that the Mad Max series can be compared in an analogy that I think fits the story well enough. And I also will say that because it has Fury Road in it, the Mad Max series is one of my favorite movie series of all time. But I think the Mad Max series can be compared to a car. because a lot of it's focused on driving in the wasteland. A lot of it is focused on crashing into each other and warriors and constant driving. It just fits the theme of the series. And I think my overall analogy is not perfect because I'm not a car expert, but the best way to describe it is that the first movie is that old car that you have, and it doesn't necessarily run the best anymore. It's kind of outdated, behind on the times. But if you're willing to put in the time, it's definitely worth driving. The second one is that very well-oiled and well-maintained V8 that you have in your garage and you drive around on the weekends all the time. It's so good, and it never really seems to sputter or get messed up. It's very well preserved. The third one is a car that you buy, a used car that you buy, and after 6 months, it breaks down on the side of the road, and you're stuck waiting for your car insurance to come and pick you up and fix the car for the next 10 hours. Fury Road is essentially what happens when you have the rusty frame of a car that has the tires almost nearly ripped off all the way, and all of the doors are dented. So you think to yourself, how do I make this thing go fast? I know, I'll drink the gasoline. You get in the car, and somehow you end up going over 500 miles an hour. That's Mad Max Fury Road. And Furiosa is honestly the best way I can describe it. It's like a stick shift on the freeway. I've seen this happen before. Trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. It's definitely something you can do. You can definitely do it if you're good at it. And if you can handle shifting up and down, be my guest. But it does take a quick second to get going. It doesn't exactly work all the time. And if you really want it to function as a permanent option, you're going to have to be patient. You want to give it time, let it breathe, think about it, and kind of have enough reflexes to sort of react to what it's going to do. That to me is Mad Max Furiosa, or Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. It's not perfect, and it has its flaws as an idea, but it definitely still works, and you can still watch it, and you can still get entertainment out of it, for sure, fully. I can say that with confidence. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you all for listening in to What to Watch Weekends. I will be back on the Burg next Wednesday from 8 to 9 p.m. I'll be back here on What to Watch Weekends at 9 a.m. Follow What to Watch Wednesdays at What to Watch Wednesdays on Instagram. All one word, no caps, no spaces with the @. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you all next time.